Have you ever seen these edits on TikTok or YouTube shorts? I've seen a ton of them. I found this game so satisfying that I really wanted to try it, but I've never played Farming Simulator before. Besides, I was born and have lived my entire life in an urban environment, and the only experience I had with farming before was in Minecraft. So I know nothing about agriculture, and I was wondering if I could even handle this game. To keep the experiment clean, I'll not watch any tutorials or Google anything. I have to figure this out on my own. Alright, $20 was paid and here we go. The game right away offers us several options to start. I'm not sure how all of these will impact my journey, so I just picked a preset that aligns with my skills. Next we need to create a character, but the editor's pretty limited, so you can't really do anything too wild. I just went with an average farmer though, and that's basically how I picture him in my head. And from that moment on, the first chapter of my journey started. At last, I'm playing Farming Simulator. I mean, this game has been on my wishlist for ages, yeah. And I've got a good feeling about it. And with that, I started making my way through the tutorial. The story is simple. Our grandfather Walter hands us the farm, because he can't take care of it anymore, and yeah, that's it. The interface is pretty simple. It shows the date, time, quest progress, and our balance. Movement, the map, and hints right there, they are pretty straightforward. Now we've got this thing called a cultivator, and as Walter said, we need this thing to clear the stubble so we can sow crops afterward. That's when I realized it wasn't as simple as I thought. I tried to drive straight, but even the slightest deviation threw off my tractor's trajectory. You can see the imperfections all over my field. Plus you have to account for the tractor's turning angle with this thing attached at the back, otherwise you'll end up with a mess like this. But don't worry, I got it fixed. Next we're changing the equipment, and this time we've got a seeder. But first we need to load this machine with seeds. And for some reason I completely missed the huge bag of seeds, and the game didn't give me any hints either. But 5 minutes later the job was done. And next but not least, seeding process. Walter said seeding is easy and that keeping straight lines is important. But I have my doubts. It's not easy at all to move in a straight line, just because the hardest part isn't choosing the trajectory itself, it's positioning the seeder perfectly behind the tractor in the right alignment. Alright, I give up. I've tried like 20 times, but I just can't place the tractor perfectly straight. I don't know, I guess it'll take some time to get used to it. Alright, fortunately it only took a few meters to finish the task, but I have a gut feeling we'll be returning to this field later. Now for the final step, we're using a combine. It lets us harvest the wheat and unload the crops from its container into the trailer. The only thing I didn't understand at that point was why this machine was losing goods along the way, and turns out I got it wrong. I thought it was losing wheat, but it was actually just straw. While heading to sell the wheat, I have to say, the graphics in this game are really nice. In the end, I sold all the wheat and made around $2,500, and with that, my tutorial was complete. First, I want to figure out which fields are mine. So let me take a look at the map. Alright, this thing is huge. Let me fill you in. We have farms number 2, 3, 4 and 5 at our disposal, as well as the land plot number 1. We can also sell and buy land, and I'm pretty sure its price is based solely on its size. So just by clicking around on all the buttons I could find, I realized there is way more content in the game than what the tutorial covered. It started with the crop calendar, which still was self-explanatory, then I saw the animals on my farm, their age, condition and food, a ton of contracts, production chains with various products, and finally a full economy with schedules. To keep myself from feeling overwhelmed, I decided to start with what I had already learned. I began with cultivating, thinking I would figure everything out along the way. I hoped there would be some clues to guide me, but oh, how naive I was back then. So I started cultivating the field, only to realize it had already been cultivated. I went back to switch the cultivator for the seeder, and the fact that I was already confused with just 3 machines made me worried about the road ahead of me. While seeding, I tried to come up with a plan. With all my farming knowledge, it looked something like this. Plant the seeds, take a nap, wait for everything to grow, harvest the crops, sell them for a ton of money, and then use that cash to buy a machine that does everything for me. After that, I'd buy more land and that would be it. But first I felt I needed to understand as many game mechanics as possible, so I could find the fastest way to get rich. And in case anyone's wondering, planting this field took me roughly 30 real life minutes, the smallest one I own by the way, and yet another reason why I needed to start studying this game. I decided to start by harvesting the remaining crops, which I initially thought were wheat. I quickly realized I didn't have the right equipment for that job, so I decided to find a vehicle store on the map. Fortunately, finding it on the map wasn't a problem. The real problem was inside the store. My despair grew exponentially when I visited for the first time. I had no idea what any of these machines did. Since I was feeling so confused, I decided to take my grandfather's advice. He suggested I talk to Ben, who knows a lot about farming. I was looking for something to start with, for the next step to help me understand something new and get hooked. But instead, Ben made it clear that each crop has its own set of cultivation rules. I didn't listen to him for long though, because I was afraid of deleting the game at that moment, so I decided to take a slow look around instead. We have a cow pasture with 3 cows, and we can buy more if we want. I think we can breed them and produce milk, but for now, I've decided not to get into animal care. We also have beehives, and I think one day we'll get honey and be able to sell it. There is a wheelbarrow that unfortunately we can't interact with, along with several sheds, a large barn, and plenty of other small details like a ball stuck between the trunks of the tree. But I couldn't relax for long. I noticed that canola had already grown in one of my fields and was ready to be harvested. I checked the crop calendar and realized it was August, the last month to harvest it. Waiting any longer wasn't an option, or I would lose all the income from this field. So I hopped into the combine and found the AI worker activation button. In this game, these workers function like hired employees who need to be paid, but I was just relieved that this feature existed. While my canola was being harvested, I had some free time to explore the store. And luckily, on my first attempt, I bought exactly the machine I needed, a baler. Even though this machine was useless on my canola field, it let me turn the leftover straw from my wheat harvest into bales. This purchase gave me hope that I wasn't completely helpless and literally saved my dream of a bright future. The only downside was that the AI worker couldn't handle these tasks, so I had to do everything myself. But I still didn't understand why I couldn't make bales on the canola field. My best guess was that I needed to gather the straw into piles since it was just scattered around the field. And I was even more confused about why the harvester behaved differently on different fields. So I went to the store in search of a machine that could gather straw into rows, and based on the description I picked what I seemed like the best option, brought it back to my farm, and then realized that I had just wasted $9,000. But I didn't give up and decided to try again, thinking I had just picked the wrong equipment and all that, only to lose another 15,000. Clearly both of these machines were meant for something else. I honestly tried to figure it out, spending another hour in the store, but I got nowhere. So I took my tractor with a trailer, hoping I could load the bales onto it, and it worked. And excited, I set off to sell them, hoping to recover some money that I had lost on buying machines, but no one wanted to buy my bales. I had to leave the bales at home to free up the trailer for the canola I was harvesting. By then it was already night and it was raining. I was screwed. In just my first month on the farm, I had burned through half of my capital. That's when I decided I needed to start reading everything I could find. So I began studying everything inside just to figure out what am I doing wrong in this game. And that was the end of the first month. September greeted me with a morning fog and it was truly beautiful, but I had to make money. The first thing I decided to do is to sell my canola, and fortunately I had already figured out that grain prices vary depending on where you sell them. Unfortunately though, I only realized later that prices also depend on the time of the year. And just like that, the canola was sold for a sweet $12,000. Finally, I managed to find some clues. Since 2 of my fields were already sown with canola, I could check their details and see what they needed. That's when I started to understand why the game had such a huge variety of equipment. I decided to go step by step and noticed that the field required lime. Spending more and more time at the store, I started noticing small details like the icon on the lime bags page. By comparing it to the icons on machine pages, I realized I could check if 2 things were compatible. I also discovered that vehicles could be leased instead of bought, which would save me a ton of money in case of a mistake. After filling the machine with lime, I drove to the field to spread it. But once again something fell off. After thinking it though, I realized that the lime should have been spreaded before planting the crop. There was nothing I could do about it now, so I moved on to the next step in my plan, and that was rolling the field. But my plans were postponed a bit, because once again after returning to the store and looking around I discovered the construction button, and that discovery was again changing, because it opened up a whole new world of possibilities, as landscape customization, construction new buildings, and also selling old unnecessary ones. I figured it would be wiser to get rid of a couple of sheds and reinvest that money into production, so I could start making a profit as soon as possible. Wherever I looked, the game kept revealing more and more possibilities. Should I invest in honey production, maybe build a greenhouse, or set up a generator for passive income? The more I explored this game, the more overwhelmed I felt. What I had learned in the tutorial was barely scratching the surface. This game was far bigger than I had imagined. But sitting still wasn't an option. I found a roller in the store, and since it was quite expensive, I decided to rent it instead. I used it on the field and no surprise, nothing worked as expected, but at least this time I managed to get rid of most of the weeds. The roller didn't work on an empty field either, which left me with only one option, using it right after planting the crops. Feeling desperate, I decided to at least tackle the weeds. After reading the description 10 times, I bought the cheapest machine for the job, and for the first time since the baler, my plan actually worked. The weeds were gone. I also discovered a status window for my fields in the menu, which turned out to be really convenient. Since I had the chance, I decided to spread lime on my 2 unsown fields. I brought the tractor over, and as soon as the AI worker started working, I knew I had gotten it right this time. During this time, I made one important purchase that I just have to mention. I tried it out almost immediately, and I can confidently say that the chainsaw and logging mechanics are some of the most well-developed and satisfying aspects of the game. From that moment on, to my surprise, I actually started making progress. The AI workers handle most of the tasks, and I only had to step in occasionally to fix small issues. That's why I had a free moment and decided to rent a pickup truck to sell the tree I had cut down earlier. If you're wondering, it's not a bush, it's just me on my way to sell it. After about 5 minutes of figuring out how to make the sale, I walked away with $300. It wasn't much, so I headed back to the fields. So I cultivated, planted, limed, and rolled, doing the same process for both fields. The only difference was that I used the biggest field for wheat and the smaller one for canola, just to compare their profits in the future. It was a tough month, my brain was boiling, but I finally learned how to take care of crops, and that was the most important thing. By the way, I tried to figure out how to take care of animals, but the only thing I managed was providing them with water. I even gave them a straw bale, but for some reason it didn't work. While exploring the map, I discovered a working ferry that could take me across the river for free. I also noticed a bunch of bales up on the attic of my barn. Curious, I found a ladder and climbed up into this creaky, dimly lit space. I suddenly felt like I was in a completely different game. It was unexpectedly fun. I love how this game is filled with so many little details like this. Also that night I decided to build a sawmill since it was one of the cheapest factories available. With plenty of trees on my farm, this factory would allow me to produce wooden beams and planks, which at my first glance seemed to be worth a good amount of money, and just like that, a whole new chapter began. I began cutting down trees and carrying the wood to my sawmill, officially kicking off my first production line. It didn't take long for me to discover that the maximum weight I could lift was 200 kilograms, which was pretty impressive to be honest. And so September came to an end. I knew I had to wait a whole year for my crops to grow, but I didn't want to just sit around. With some free time on my hands, I decided to fully dive into logging and understand everything about it. I found a machine that looked absolutely impressive. According to the description, it could cut down multiple trees at once. The price was steep, but I could afford to rent it for a month. On top of that, I needed a trailer to transport the logs, so I picked what seemed the best option for the price. But unfortunately it didn't attach to my tractor, so I had to rent a truck as well. I went for the cheapest option and luckily it worked. And like that, I was left with just $4,000 in my pocket. And just as I was about to try out my new equipment, a message popped up The trees were too thick. I was disappointed, but at least there were trees on my farm that I could actually cut down. Plus, my sawmill was nearby, so I could deliver the logs directly. That was convenient. I cut down the straight trees quickly, but that was only a small part of the job. What really frustrated me was that I couldn't even cut down these small bushes, even though their trunks weren't thick at all. I started to wonder if the issue was the equipment itself. Had I once again rented the wrong machine? I lost my temper. What was the point? I could cut down a massive tree with $1,000 chainsaw, but a machine 300 times more expensive couldn't handle it. Anyway, I needed a new machine and a new strategy. But at that moment, I had a bigger problem. I was completely out of money. And the best solution I could come up with was to sell my farm's barn. Sure, it had a cool attic, but I never really liked this thing anyway. After researching everything I could find about forestry, I finally settled on a plan. I spent 20,000 on leasing that huge vehicle and was ready to get to work. The idea was simple. I would cut down the trees with a chainsaw and haul them straight to my sawmill. But that didn't work either. It felt like every idea I had in this game just failed. Before, my sawmill would take whole trees without an issue, but now it just wouldn't. Maybe it was about the weight, I thought. But then, why wouldn't it take this 700 kilos piece when it was clearly lighter than a whole tree? Yet, I sawed it in half and suddenly it worked again. Pissed off, I decided to just sell this tree instead. But after 20 minutes of struggling with all the small branches sticking out in every direction, I still couldn't load it into the truck. In the end, I gave up and left the whole mess as it was, hoping that the sawmill would eventually take the tree when it needed it. For whatever reason, I was convinced there had to be a way to cut wood efficiently, so I went all in and rented the most expensive machine. I even had to sell the baler just to afford it. And it worked. Well, only on straight trees. But all that remained were massive twisted trees and those infuriating down-each serviceberry bushes, the worst of them all. The machine was huge and clumsy, constantly getting stuck on stumps. On top of that, it could only cut specific trees, like some kind of chosen ones. And I spent my last money on it. At that moment it hit me. After 3 months on the farm, I had burned through all my savings. Sold every building my grandfather's left behind and was left with nothing. I was at a crossroads, either go bankrupt or find a way to turn things around. I figured quests would be a great way to make money while also learning how different machines worked. At the same time, I could keep cutting down trees and selling the extra wood from my land, so I turned up some music and got to grinding. By that point, I had spent 20 hours in the game, I had a solid grasp of forestry, learning how to separate branches from trunks, remove stumps, and even plant new trees. Removing stumps, by the way, was incredibly frustrating. At first I even made a satisfying time-lapse to show you guys what 12 minutes of real life look like when you're trying to remove a massive stump like that, and I actually have 5 of these time-lapses, but instead I'd rather show you how I spent an entirety just trying to attach the mulcher to the excavator. It never said anywhere, but apparently it had to be attached sideways. I even made a separate series just for the mulcher, excavator and stumps, because they earned their own dedicated spot in hell. But at the same time, I realized that the chainsaw was an incredible tool. It didn't need fuel and could handle almost any task. I also started to recognize difference in tree types, and soon I had a favorite perfectly straight pine tree. No doubt about it, this tree belongs on the bliss list. and least favorite, this one. After cutting it down, you simply got 4 sticks that cost nothing, and simply taking a ton of time to care them. And the main difference in big trees is that most of them have a ton of branches covering the trunk, and you have to remove every single one manually, so I think it goes without saying which one tree I ended up planting. Also, I accidentally failed some contracts because I didn't complete them before midnight, which should have resulted in a fine, but luckily the game has plenty of bugs, and weirdly enough, surrendering a contract at the start of the day only cost you $600 in penalties, so of course I took advantage of that because none of the contracts mentioned penalties up front. In general, I kept learning the mechanics and experimenting with new things. And speaking of new things, I remember I came up with a great joke when I flipped over on a bridge with all the wood I had been collecting for 10 hours. That's when I found the help button in the menu, but the joke quickly ended because it actually turned out to be a lifesaver. That's how I discovered the in-game guides, the first real hints I'd seen since the tutorial, and for the first time I could actually learn something new without having to figure out everything on my own and losing money and my temper in the process. I was terrified of losing all the money I had worked so hard to earn, so I needed a solid plan. I read the entire help page from top to bottom and picked up a lot of important information. Also, it gave me a huge boost in confidence, but it still didn't cover everything. I'll keep it simple so you don't have to go through the whole explanation and my learning process. So first, there are different ways to boost your next harvest yield. Mulching plus 3%, rolling plus 2%, lime plus 15%, fertilizing plus 23%. This thing can be done twice, but maxes out at 45%. Don't ask me why, I have no clue. Weed removal plus 10%, and the mysterious free bonus plus 25%. I have no idea why, but I always get it. Knowing those numbers, I created the most efficient plan to manage the field. Lime, cultivate, sow, fertilize twice, remove weeds, and harvest. Of course, we'll keep rolling and mulching because the 5% bonus isn't worth the cost of buying machines and spending the time on it. The next step was to find the right machines to execute the plan. I had read on the help page that some seeders can cultivate, sow, and fertilize the field all in one go, so that's how I found and bought that machine. Then I purchased a separate machine for fertilizing and one for liming. I believe you could use the same machine for both tasks, but that would mean driving all the way to the shop and back just to change the container filling, and honestly I'm too lazy for that. Next, I bought a machine for spreading herbicide to destroy weeds. It seemed like the most efficient option because weeds can be vary in size, and you need the right machine to deal with different sizes, but herbicide works for any weed size, so it was the best choice for me. And as for harvester, I already had one. With that, my plan was complete. I was extremely relieved as I had spent nearly 3 hours reading and double-checking everything to make sure nothing would go wrong, because as you know, those machine prices aren't cheap and one wrong choice could cost me hours of chopping trees just to make up for it. By the end of the day, I was left with $38,000, which meant I had spent nearly $200,000 on equipment, and now all I could do was hope that it would be worth it. June arrived, and that meant I could finally harvest my barley. Since I had sold my old baler, I had to buy a new one to collect the straw. That's when I discovered that straw is a byproduct when it comes from wheat, barley, and oats. This explained why sometimes the harvester left neat piles of straw and other times just scattered it across the field. I sold the crop in bales, making almost $10,000 from the barley itself and another $4,500 from the straw. Next, I started liming the field since that was the first step in my field management plan. But after seeing the results, I realized I had spent $1,200 just on lime. On top of that, I would have to pay wages if I wanted an AI worker to handle the job. The cost was almost the same amount I would gain from the 15% yield bonus, so in the end, spreading lime seemed like a useless step overall, and just like that, my plan became even simpler. Finally, July arrived, which meant I could harvest all my crops from every field. I harvested the canola and decided to store it in a silo. After all, I wasn't just a farmer, I was also a market guru, so the game allows us to predict product prices at any time of the year, and selling canola in July wasn't profitable, so I made the choice to hold on to it until November, when the prices would be much better. All that was left was to harvest the wheat, and for wheat I decided to take things a step further and build a grain mill. believing that turning wheat into flour would be more profitable than selling it as a raw grain. August arrived, which meant it was time to plant crops. My first year on the farm had passed, and with all the knowledge I had gained, it was finally time to put it to use. Among other things, I learned that with a plow I could create new fields, so I decided to merge my 3 fields into one larger, also expanding them a little on borders. It didn't turn out perfectly even, but to my surprise everything worked on the first try. As for crop to plant, I decided to go with canola. Long story short, the game has 23 different crops, each with its own planting methods, care requirement and specialized machinery, but only 6 of them are grain type crops, which I believe follow the same field management process. And out of those 6 I chose the most expensive one because I'm aiming for the highest profit. It took me the whole day to get everything done as planned, but once the job was finished I felt relief. Now I finally had some free time to take on contracts for extra cash and maybe even try something new. The next month I sprayed both fields with herbicide and fertilizer, and for the rest of the year I basically just waited for the harvest to ripen. What's interesting is that after all those hours in the game I kept discovering new mechanics, like the fact that tractors can be washed and repaired, or that if you tilt a chainsaw slightly, the tree will fall in the direction of the tilt. The game was also packed with small details like working windshield wipers and reflections in mirrors. But the real thing I cared about was my pocket, so as I said, I was doing contracts, a lot of them. And to be clear, most of them were fulfilled by my AI workers while I just claimed the profit. I also bought this cheap trailer for $10,000 and honestly, it was an absolute steal. It's hard to explain how happy I was because for small sticks it was 10 times more convenient than my big trailer. In December, canola prices were great, so I sold everything I had stored in my silo, and from that I got $27,000, which was a great amount of money. Since I had some money to burn, I decided to build a couple of greenhouses. The doors worked in a really strange way, but I was intrigued because the only thing they required were water and time. There were also different crops to grow, each consuming a different amount of water and having different growth cycles per month, which I assume was the growing speed. And to keep things simple, I grew every single crop and then compared their prices. That's how I found out that lettuce was the most profitable option. The biggest problem with all of these products is that they come in pallets. Each pallet weighs at least 400 kilos and it is twice what we can lift with our bare hands. So to load the pallets into the trailer, I bought that little guy right there. It only cost me $35,000 and honestly, it's really easy to control. The only downside of it is that I have to load the pallets one by one because it can't handle heavy weights. And honestly, pallets are really annoying. It's such a hassle to load them onto a trailer. The good news is that we can sell products directly from the factory, so as soon as a product is produced, it gets sold automatically. I mean, yeah, I could store all of these products, wait for the best price of the year, then load and deliver them for more profit, but as I've said, I'm lazy. I mean, just look at how I made $10,000 from flour. It took too many steps for that amount of money. And if you're curious, after a year and a half, the beehives on my farm finally produced a single pallet of honey, which I sold for $2,000. It's also important to mention that production itself made up a significant share of my profits, so I spent some time calculating the average numbers, and right now I have one grain meal which produced $2,000 per month, 2 sawmills $10,000 per month each, 2 greenhouses $3,000 per month each. So when June rolled around and I had just 1 month left before the canola harvest, I decided to invest a big part of my savings into an oil mill. It seemed like a smart move since oil could be sold for 2.5 times the price of raw canola. And my trees were growing well, which was a huge relief because I had no clue what the correct spacing was when I planted the trees. Luckily I got it right, but they were still too young to cut down. Since I wanted to maximize my yield, I decided to wait another year for them to reach their second growth stage. In July, I harvested all the canola from both fields and unloaded everything into my oil mill. In total, I got around 45,000 liters of canola, which was almost 4 times more than last year. But that's where I run into a real problem. Turns out the oil mill requires 2 liters of canola to produce just 1 liter of oil, which means the factory only adds a 25% value increase. And that's not even the worst part. Since I'm selling oil directly from the factory, I won't even get the best market price. On top of that, selling buildings only refunds 50% of their cost, meaning I just lost $120,000 on a completely useless factory. And I wish I knew the production rates before building it, but it is what it is. For the next planting, I decided to use only one field for canola, while the other field I planted with grass. Because before that I had already completed a few contracts for mowing grass, making bales and wrapping them. I thought it would be interesting to see how much money could actually be made from grass. Meanwhile, my eye worker was busy seeding my own fields, and I just kept grinding through contracts. To my surprise, the grass grew in just 2 months. I rented all the necessary machines and started with mowing. As it often happens, the AI worker didn't finish the job and refused to continue, but everything went according to plan anyway. After mowing, the grass had to be collected in rows. While the AI was handling that, I started baling. Unfortunately, I got cheap with the baler, and this type of machine couldn't be operated by the AI workers, so the process took forever. And finally wrapping, which also had to be done manually. By the time I finished, it was already dark outside, but I managed to find the right equipment to load the bales. But it was too early to sell the bales because the whole point of wrapping them is that after some time the grass ferments into silage, and silage sells for twice the price of regular grass, so I waited until the next day to sell them. Even selling the bales took a ton of time, but in the end I made $83,000, and after subtracting the leasing cost, that left me with around $60,000 in profit, and honestly, that was not bad at all. The biggest downside though is that the whole process took me 17 in-game hours, which is 3.5 real-life hours, and since I couldn't assign these tasks to my workers, I had to do everything manually, and it was painfully boring, to be honest. In the meantime, I cut down a few trees, firstly to constantly keep the sawmills running, and secondly to clear more space. Besides, I had already rented a loader for bales, and it worked good as well for loading logs. Also, my little forest of pine trees was about to grow soon, and I had a lot of unnecessary wood that I didn't want to sell for cheap. That's when I decided to build a paper factory. Among all the products you can make from wood, paper seemed like one of the most profitable options, so I built it. Luckily, I accidentally discovered the option to borrow money from the bank, and that's exactly how I managed to afford it. I loaded all the wood into the factory, and although the unloading area was far from convenient, I managed to do it. A few months later, I decided to plant cotton instead of grass, and only after I finished planting did I realize that cotton comes in bales. And as you already know, I hate bales, but there was no turning back. Fortunately, my plan with the paper factory worked perfectly, and it alone brought me around $40,000 per month. So money was no longer an issue. With my new income, I bought a neighborhood field and planted cotton there as well. The next step was to remove all the stumps that were left near my factory. I had been putting it off for as long as I could, but the time had finally come. By the way, I didn't mention it earlier, but I sold my greenhouses, and that spot should become a place to build new ones. In-game we have two versions of the mulcher, one that I used before which was cheap, and another one that attached to the tractor. Since I had enough money for either of them, I decided to try a new one, and it turned out to be a billion times better. I spent the whole day playing with that new toy and removed every single tree on my entire farmland. I left just a couple for my granddad though, because I think he was already unhappy that his farm had almost turned into a factory. So I was ready to build greenhouses after a bit of landscaping here. The biggest problem with my previous greenhouses was that they consumed a ton of water, so the plan was to build a water source as close as possible to the greenhouses. That way I could simply drive my tractor back and forth, filling every single greenhouse with water. Also, I found out that water capacity can be increased by placing water tanks nearby, so I placed a couple of those because I definitely don't want to refill the greenhouses every single month. And as usual, things didn't go as planned. But this time, things actually worked better than planned. Firstly, I could fill a barrel with water and simultaneously fill the nearest greenhouse. And what was even better, other greenhouses didn't run out of water. I spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out how it worked. Eventually I realized it had something to do with the water tanks. Maybe they create some sort of water supply system because from what I understand they work in a radius and supply water to all greenhouses at once. But honestly, it could be just a bug. And all of those greenhouses brought me around $40,000 per month, which honestly felt completely overpowered. The next month, my pines finally grew. I rented the most expensive machine again, hoping that all the problems I had before were because I tried to cut uneven trees. But this time, my pines were perfectly straight. And to my surprise, the machine actually worked. But guess what? It still felt slow and uncomfortable to use. So, just out of curiosity, I grabbed my chainsaw and tried to do the same job manually, and it was way faster. I was absolutely pissed off because for the price for that one machine, I could buy 750 chainsaws. It's like buying a Lamborghini that can't go faster than a bicycle. And literally 5 minutes later, the tree got stuck on the textures, and the game turned into a slideshow. I tried everything, loading the last save, restarting the game, skipping days, even removing all the branches at 5 FPS, but nothing worked. The funniest thing is that this didn't happen when I first removed the trees in this place, even though those trees were way more messy and uneven. You see, at that point I had already spent around 60 hours in the game. I covered most aspects of it, except for animals of course. I wish I could show more content, but I simply ran out of strength and patience, so I gave up and just went to have fun. And you know, this game is brutal. It's not Stardew Valley or Minecraft. The first struggle of it is the lack of knowledge. You never know which equipment works well until you try it. I spent 2 hours removing stumps with the wrong mulcher, while a better one could do the job in 10 minutes. Same thing happened with the mower, baler, forestry equipment, trailers, and so on. The second issue is the lack of guidance. I would have quit earlier if I hadn't found the help menu. No wonder guides on YouTube get hundreds of thousands of views. That guy Farmer Co-op even made them 134 video tutorial playlist. It's insane, and I honestly dreamed of watching such videos during my journey. And lastly, for me, the game is not arcade enough. Manually loading pallets and bales or spending 10 hours cutting down a small forest. I mean, man, it's really frustrating sometimes. I checked the most downloaded mods and all of them make the game easier. Not a single one makes it harder. But after all, it's a simulator, so I get why it's this complex. And speaking about the good things, first of all, the graphics, details and sounds are simply amazing. Secondly, the game is truly peaceful. At first I felt uncomfortable with how slow everything was, but after 20 hours it somehow forced me to be patient. I stopped chasing progress and started exploring the game at my own pace. And from that point on, everything went uphill. And lastly, no doubt, this is a great game in general. I really enjoyed it. After the first 40 hours of struggle, once you understand all the mechanics, you can actually start building your dream farm. And when a game has so many mechanics, it means that you can truly let your imagination run wild. And I'm pretty sure that following that path would bring you tons of peaceful and unforgettable hours of gameplay. At last, I tried to play as an honest farmer to feel the realistic experience, so I skipped all the exploits I found on purpose, and I really hope you enjoyed this approach. So put a million likes under this video and then I'll go to a real farm or whatever YouTuber says at the end. Peace out.